Trends in Canadian independent schools. I represent a group of schools in Canada, and what's interesting about Canada, as you know, is that education is provincially mandated, but these are a group of schools that are required to go above and beyond the minimum provincial standards. And so that's what ties these K schools together, and Ridley, of course, is one of the important members. All of our schools are committed then to continuous whole school improvement. And so really they're committed to being learning institutions. And I'm going to talk about why that's more important than ever to be continuously hungry to improve the future of education. We asked our heads and chairs 3 years ago, what are the top 3 challenges in your schools? And we expected them to say these 3 things because that's certainly what everybody seemed to be talking about. But the reason that we are so passionate about research is because the top 3 challenges actually came back looking like this. So we've spent the last few years really trying to understand what is it that concerns everybody in this area of HR. And what we learned is that we want to ensure that our schools have the best teachers. How do you define the best teachers in this day and age? Well, it's very much tied to number 3, and that is this whole area of managing change. Because the landscape of independent school education is changing so much, and our schools have to be leaders in this field. So what are some of the changes? We certainly see that there are leaders out there, such as Tony Wagner, who's with the Change Institute at Harvard, who's looking at what are the skills that our kids need. On the subtitle there is what our best schools aren't teaching and what we need to do about it. And he identified 7 skills that kids need. And if you take a look at those skills, there's nothing really high-tech about the kinds of skills that people are saying our kids need in the future. But here's what's interesting. Our provinces have spent enormous amounts of time and resources identifying what math looks like in grades 3, 6, 9, and 12. But they haven't actually spent time resourcing what these kinds of skills look like. And if you spend time watching somebody like a Sir Ken Robinson, who asked the question, are schools killing creativity? You can see why we have an opportunity with our independent schools to really do something that is unique, but also something that will really prepare our kids for a future that we don't know what it's going to look like. He's recently come out with a book called Creating Innovators. He spent a lot of time in Finland. He's a great person to start looking at in terms of the future. So sometimes I think if you don't want to listen to these academic types on what the kids need, here's a scan of IBM's 388,000 employees in 2008 in terms of what skills are needed to prepare kids for the workforce. Go down that right-hand column and you'll see it's the same kinds of skills. We need to be teaching kids the power of collaboration and creativity and innovation. There's also been a recent trend on character education. And I'm a big believer in reading any book that basically says that today's parents are not doing a great job. I think that's an important thesis. And so Paul Tough really talks about grit, and then Madeline Levine talks about things like resiliency. And so you'll see a lot of attention there. Now our schools have a particular tough time teaching those skills because parents are paying tuition not really then to allow their children to fail, right? So when our kids were trying out for the soccer teams, I did have this sense of, you know, I want Jacob to make the soccer team, and please don't cut him because I do have a sense of entitlement because I'm paying for that education, even though getting cut from a team is actually really good for their character development. So we have this particular tension happening in an independent school. The other challenge that we have are the increasing expectations of today's parents, and whether you call them the helicopter parents or the parking lot mafia or the SUV caucus, there's a lot of attention towards today's parents, and we're seeing it now at the university level, which I find really interesting. So schools also then have to do things like we're doing right now to bring along today's parents to help them understand the kinds of changes that we should be seeing in our schools, because they're actually sometimes the ones least resistant to change. A really interesting trend is the proliferation of online learning, and you've probably seen Khan Academy. In fact, Kathleen, who's here in grade 7, this was her homework. So we learned about ratio the other night using one of these Khan Academy videos, and they're brilliant. So when you've got these kinds of things for free online, I think it's really challenging our schools to do things like flip teaching. So this video is for homework, and then during the day the teacher can then work through some of the classes. So how do our schools use what's available online in innovative ways? The other challenge, though, with technology is that then there are more and more online schools, and parents who are quite savvy are looking at this as a possible free opportunity for their kids. And so we have to think about what's our competitive advantage. Why are parents going to pay $20,000 to attend a school? I'm also really interested in following what's happening at the university level. Does everyone know what a MOOC is? They're called these massive open online courses. And the elite colleges in America are the leaders in this area. So you've got Stanford, who started Udacity, Harvard and MIT starting edX, and then Stanford, Princeton, UPenn, and Berkeley starting Coursera. So all of these schools right now are just tripping over each other to be the leaders in the online education world. They haven't yet figured out the business model, which I think is really important for all of us to think about. But they are out there trying to figure out what the future of learning is going to look like. Now here's something, though, that I think is really worth paying attention to as a boarding school. We know, I recently heard that 20% of liberal arts colleges that existed in the 90s in the States are now out of business. So here's an interesting trend worth looking at. Stanford University has opened an online high school. So you can go to Stanford, you can do a bunch of different options. You can have a full-time program for about $16,000. You can take a few courses, you can take one course. You can do an on-campus experience for 4 months in the summer. So now suddenly our competition is coming from places like a Stanford. So if Stanford is getting into this high school business, it's no wonder that we see a lot of independent schools in the States and in Canada getting into the preschool business, because we're all looking for more students. So huge potentials there with online high schools. And just figuring out how that's going to work for a lot of our schools. I actually believe that boarding schools are best positioned to be leaders in this area of online learning because you've got the kids on campus 24/7 and they can do a lot more with a lot of flexibility. So I think one of the important questions to ask is, have we actually changed? What's happening in the classrooms with our students? And what you're looking at here might be deceptive, because I look at a lot of smartboard use in classrooms across the country, and I think they're being used much like a chalkboard. So I think sometimes, in fact, I was in one school and there was stuff sticky tacked to a smartboard, so that's a $5,000 bulletin board. However, this is actually a picture from Kathleen's class when Mr. Bowie taught her in grade 3. I don't know if Mr. Bowie's here. But she came home and she said, we're studying World War II and I'd like to interview Great Pa, which is my grandfather. And I said, no, he can barely get to the dining room. He's not going to get to Ridley College to be interviewed by your class. Lovely idea. She came home the next day and she said, so I talked to Mr. Bowie and we can Skype him into the class. This is how kids think now. So suddenly, even though I have a full-time job and I'm traveling all the time, I was now heading into Hamilton, sitting with my grandfather so that I could Skype him, so that the kids in the grade 3 class could ask things like, was your boat torpedoed when you were in the Navy? That was a boy. What did you eat when you were on the ship? That was a girl. So flash forward now to 2013, we asked our schools again. This time we broadened the audience to about over 500 people and said, okay, what are the top issues facing our schools today? And there was no surprise when the top 3 issues came back looking this way. And they're all revenue-based. I heard recently that if you're going to be successful as a business, you have to focus on 3 things. You have to focus on revenue. You have to focus on what is something that uniquely differentiates you. And you have to focus on, well, there is no number 3. You actually only have to focus on what's unique and revenue. So I want to talk a little bit more about some of these things that are happening in our independent schools. The first is we're all facing a shrinking demographic situation in Canada. And so when you see things like this, we know that we're all in the business of competing for kids. There was an unnoticed headline in the United States in the summer that was something like this, that For the first time in American history, the birth rate to non-white Americans exceeded the birth rate to white Americans. So in the States, you have the additional challenge of having to deal with a lack of diversity in our schools. But we definitely have a demographic issue. What you're looking at here is one school, the Bishop Strachan School in Toronto, who was generous enough to share this with us. This is their increase in price over 20 years, and that's the red line. The white line is the increase according to the Canadian Consumer Price Index. So when people are saying things like, are we pricing ourselves out of reach for today's parents? Here's a really great visual, I think, that shows you that that's a very important question that we all have to talk about, and Ian also talked about the whole pricing question. So I looked at Ridley's fees, and I talked to Jim Park, and I asked him if he could share the increase in Ridley fees over the last 20 years. And he joked, he said that Ridley used to be compared to the price of a Chevy. A boarding school tuition used to be similar to the price of a Chevy. So I looked up those two numbers, and we see that the average cost of a Chevy was actually about $5,000 cheaper than a Ridley boarding school tuition. And I watched how these numbers have increased over time. So we see that the Chevy's price change over 20 years was just under $3,000, whereas a Ridley boarding school tuition's increase is just under $30,000. And now I want to be really clear that Ridley's tuition prices here and this kind of increase is absolutely representative of schools across North America. So this isn't a Ridley issue. This is an issue for all schools. So I thought, all right, well, I drive a used Acura MDX. How did that price change over time? So in 2003, Ridley boarding school education would have actually been more like an MDX. But today, even that is cheaper than boarding school tuition. So this is a very real issue, and there's a lot of research being done on price point sensitivity in our independent schools. So we have to be looking at different kinds of options available to us. I think actually one of the things that you're doing with flex boarding is quite innovative, and I see that, I think it's St. Andrews now who's doing a transition boarding program, so you can do a part of a year or a year only of boarding. We know Appleby College requires all of its graduates to do a year of boarding in grade 12 before going to university. So there's some kind of different models out there that can address these kinds of issues. What schools are doing then is they're continuing to offer more and more financial aid to get students to their campus. So in terms of case schools that are participating in our benchmarking data, we see that we are investing actually more in financial assistance. So we've given out $43 million last year, 2 years ago, 47 last year, and then we're waiting on data for this year. The average amount awarded in Canada is also increasing from $8,771 to $9,318. So we're seeing schools invest quite heavily in endowment. So you may have noticed Upper Canada College and Lakefield have both launched $100 million campaigns with a commitment for about half of those monies to be allocated towards endowment. So what does that mean in terms of, where are we in terms of Canada? Of the 88 schools that participated in our research last year, 67 of them had endowment. The average value was $6 million. The top endowment in a Canadian independent school right now is $56 million. Second place is $25 million. So to give you a national perspective, that's $400 million, and it's increasing and will continue to increase. Just to give you some perspective in the States, I sit on the board of TABS with the head of Exeter, who's talking about how their endowment really took a hit in 2007, 2008, but fortunately it's still sitting at $1 billion. So where is all this money going when you're paying your tuition? And so one of the things we looked at through our benchmarking just confirmed what we knew anecdotally, and that is that the majority of your resources are going to pay for the great teachers. And of course, a lot of our schools pay salaries that are comparable to the public grid, which is something that's not necessarily the case in the United States. But my concern when I look at a graph like this is that advancement is this second from the bottom, is that little purple slice up at the top. So our schools aren't actually investing heavily in advancement. And so the question is, if I give you 25 cents and you give me back $1, why wouldn't I give out more quarters to people to continue to bring money into our schools? So that's another opportunity, I think, for Ridley, is to be looking at ways that they can invest more, build more of an endowment to increase the diversity, offer more spots to kids. We're faced with a bit of a perfect storm, actually, in independent schools right now, and I grabbed this out of the paper a couple of years ago. It's because our local school board is advertising for kids. So the history of independent schools is such that when the public schools weren't doing well, and whether that's perceived or reality, when they aren't doing well, our school enrollment tended to increase. But the reality is now that all of our schools are competing for kids. They're seeking aggressively to get students. And we saw a couple of years ago the Toronto District School Board was hit the papers because they were hiring a high salary marketing communications person. So we're all in the business of trying to search for students. A really big trend in the public system is for them to invest in homestay programs. And that's an absolute cash cow for the public system. But one of the reasons why we have to invest more heavily in recruitment efforts internationally is because the public schools are also out there around the world bringing kids in to their system. And that's about 1/3 of the price. So the competition for us is real. We know today's parents are very savvy and are looking at, okay, I can spend this on a tuition, or I can get this for free, and then I can supplement it with tutoring centers and their co-curriculars and all their activities. If you saw the Canadian Living magazine this month, I actually was quoted as saying something like, if parents would just add up all of those extra activities that they are spending their money on, they would see that actually an independent school tuition isn't that expensive, because you can give up a lot of those evening activities when right in-house we have a great arts program here, a great music program here, and that's sort of the mentality that I think that we should be talking about as a group of parents. So the sad story in Canadian independent schools is that we are seeing some school closures. I stopped and snapped this picture on my way into work. This was Grey Gables School, and it was really sad, I found, because I could still see writing on the chalkboard through the window. But this is the truth. There's schools closing. There are lots of people discussing about the realities, harsh realities of financial sustainability. I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes on boarding schools, because I think that's something that is really important to this school in particular. So 4 or 5 years ago, some of the admissions directors got together and they wanted to talk about the trend that they were seeing. So in 2007, 2008, we had about 4,800 boarding students in our 27 case boarding schools. And watch what's happened over the years. So this is why the alarm bells were going off. So what we've seen in the last couple of years, I like to say it's because our schools are now collaborating and doing collaborative marketing and research and so on. But we're still seeing that there is an absolute negative trend, and we're down by over 500 kids in our 27 boarding schools in Canada. So I want you to think for a moment, if the average boarding school tuition is about $40,000, you can see then what kind of a significant financial loss this is for our schools. Just a couple of other things. Canadian boarding student enrollment has decreased by 8%, so we're more and more relying on international students, which is up by 14%. If you look at the central line here, this is just a breakdown of Canadian and international enrollment. Central is at about 37%, and international student boarding in central Canada is at about 63%. Just to give you a sense, I spoke to Ed, a kid last night, that we're at about 300 boarders at Ridley right now, about. 100 of those boarders are Canadian. So we're just slightly below the Ontario, Central Canada trends. A concerning thing for all of us is that only 10 countries make up 80% of our boarding school international enrollment, and you can see that 24% of our kids are coming from China. So there's a lot of talk as more schools in China are opening up, and some talk of what would happen if they close the doors to sending kids overseas. We see that new boarding students are costing more to find, and there's a lot of turnover. And we also know that about a third of parents are reevaluating their commitment to an independent school every year. And so more and more international students, in order to get them here, we're having to pay out money to agents and their fees. And then we see that the number of financial assistance offered, particularly at boarding schools, is high. And so just back to the Ridley example, if you have 300 kids, 100 of those are Canadian. Of those 100, approximately 50 of those are full fee paying Canadians. So it's costing us more to bring students here. There's just way more competition. And what I would say, every boarding school is talking about this question. Are there enough full fee paying domestic families in Canada to continue to support strong domestic boarding schools? So here we are. I think you're at a great point as a school to be thinking about these kinds of big strategic questions. I think we have great things that we available to us at Ridley, such as the fact that we've got a university and a college. We've got agricultural lands where we've got Niagara Falls, which is one of the most well-known tourist destinations in the world. And what are the other unique things that Ridley could possibly do as we are thinking about the future? I think we've got great opportunities. I don't know if the future will hold, physical spaces, but we know for sure that the future of learning is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week opportunity for our kids, and it won't look like this. I snapped this picture up the side of the road in August, and I thought, oh gosh, it's so depressing. Thank goodness my daughter is here at Ridley. I'm really excited to be part of this today. I do think we have a remarkable opportunity to build a very strong future for Ridley together. Thank you.